I'd like to talk to you about the power of thinking, to see the unseen connections and train your magical power of foresight through that. You don't want to be unprepared. You either lose an opportunity or you suffer the consequences of something negative. But why would you be unprepared? Mostly because you are surprised. So why would you be surprised? Because there's something you don't know. And there are two types of things that you wouldn't know. The things that you cannot know, the unknown unknowns, unknowable unknowns. And then there are the things that you perhaps should know in advance, the knowable unknowns. There are many definitions that you can study that help you structure your thinking about these unknowns. Things such as the black swans that everybody knows about, but also the grey rhinos that are not as known as a concept, but they are much more common than the black swans. So what are the unknowable unknowns? They are the things that you cannot give a probability for in advance, such as the invention of the penicillin, which was the result of poor lab hygiene. Nobody could have given a probability for that because antibiotics were a completely unknown concept. Most things are somewhat knowable, things that you can give a probability for if you ask the right question. So for example, the famous black swan. Everybody had only seen white swans in Europe, but if somebody had asked, is it possible for black swans to exist? One could have said that it is a non-zero possibility. But nobody asked that, and therefore it was assumed that all swans are white. But in Australia you have black swans, but people in Europe didn't know that. So for example, COVID-19, scientists have been predicting that over the next tens of years, the likelihood of a global pandemic will be close to 100. Yet most of us were completely unprepared for that. Most governments were practically completely unprepared for that. Some of you have lived long enough to go through a number of financial crises. I have gone through 4 of them. And yet, just a few years ago, all of us were being told by leading economists that the zero interest rate times will continue for the foreseeable future. I never believed that. But perhaps some of you did, because these authority figures were telling you that. Because we didn't learn from history. Kodak is a great example. It's a company that invented the digital camera. The first prototype that they built had a resolution of 100 times 100 pixels in black and white. Not grayscale, just black and white, so really poor pictures. But that was based on semiconductors, and semiconductors evolve via Moore's law, so it's an exponential development. This happened in the early 70s, so by the beginning of the 80s, the image quality was already much improved. And by that time, one could have assumed or asked the question, what if semiconductors will continue to evolve as they have so far? And then you would have realized that there will be a point in time when the digital camera will be much better than a film camera. What happened to Kodak? They went bankrupt because of their own invention. They didn't connect the dots. They didn't see the unseen, even if it was staring at their face. Bitcoin. Everybody was surprised by this wonderful invention. Yet I read a book called Applied Cryptography in the 90s, I think, or early 2000s, where Bruce Schneier, the author, described with code examples exactly how Bitcoin will work. But most people didn't pay any attention. Maybe Satoshi Nakamoto was the only one who paid attention and surprised everybody. Here's on a logarithmic scale the improvement in internet connectivity. And as you can see, it's a straight line. So 10 years ago, we already had decades of data on how internet connectivity improves. And we could have asked ourselves, what can happen if this same development continues? And there was no reason to assume that there's a force that will act on this development and change it. So most likely it will continue as it did. So any idea what has happened because of this development over the last 10, 15 years? Anybody listen to music nowadays? It's not local, it's streamed. Anybody watch traditional TV anymore? We watch streamed content. Anybody use email? That's all in the cloud. Anybody use WhatsApp? It's all in the cloud. These are all things that happened because of that. Everybody who asked in 2008 what could happen if this trend continues, they might have envisioned all cloud services. The ones who did became famous entrepreneurs. So why don't we connect the dots? Why don't we see the unseen? Is it just intellectual laziness? Is it too many distractions, like people texting while driving? Or is it just because we haven't figured out how can we train this ability? For the unknowable unknowns, you can also prepare by building agility as a muscle in yourself, in your organization, so that when the unexpected happens, you'll react quicker than anybody else. But we'll not talk more about that today. Let's talk more about how do we see the connections, the unseen connections. And there are lots of tools for you to use. Go to ChatGPT and ask for help and study and think about how do you practice your ability for foresight. When Jack Nicklaus hit his 18th hole-in-one, somebody patted him on the back and said that you are such a lucky guy. And Jack Nicklaus didn't like that very much, so he answered that, it's a funny thing, I have noticed that the more I practice, the luckier I get. And that applies to a lot of things. So what should you be thinking about right now? There are a lot of trends that are very reliable indicators of what will be happening. And most of us are completely ignoring these trends. Of course, climate warming is one trend that we have lots of data about. I'll not go deeper into that today because that data is widely available. Instead, let's talk a little bit about the importance of technology. So what is the ability of technology to create value? The best proxy I figured out for that is to look at how the value of publicly listed technology companies evolves. So during the last 10 years, the value of publicly listed technology companies globally has moved from roughly $4 trillion to 19 trillion, or increased by $19 trillion to $24 trillion. If that same development continues at that average speed from last 10 years, which would mean that the actual speed would decrease from it has been during the last 3, 4, 5 years, it would lead to a value increase of $64 trillion over the next 10 years. And I can't see any force acting on this trend that would slow that development. So many powerful technologies have become widely available right now, starting from AI or CRISPR, or quantum is getting close to being useful. So there's lots of transformative technologies coming online. If you believe that technology will be creating $64 trillion of new value over the next 10 years, then you know something really useful. If you are investing, if you're looking for a job, if you are thinking about how my life will change, what my kids should be studying, just knowing and believing in this will give you a new lens to look at the world. Here's an example of a set of devices that were not available 10 years, 15 years ago. Why? Because batteries were not good enough and electric motors were not good enough. But when these two became good enough, whole new areas of use cases became possible, which led to more investment into these technologies, which lowered the price of these technologies as volumes grew, which again enabled new use cases through the lowered prices and increased quality. And you could predict these virtuous circles in advance. The entrepreneurs who were the first ones to create these devices did foresee these virtuous circles. Maybe you can be the next one. AI is a powerful new technology. For each of these technologies, you could ask yourself, okay, what are the incremental short-term benefits? How do they impact me or my business? You could also ask, what are the medium-term disruptive outcomes? And then the longer-term speculative outcomes. And by asking those three questions, you broaden your perspective on the impact this particular technology will have. And remember that the biggest mistake we people usually do with new technologies is that we treat them as electric engines during the time of steam engines. When the electric motors became possible, people just swapped the steam engines to electric engines without changing anything else. The productivity improvement was very small. But the point is that electricity enabled you to redesign the whole business model, the whole logistics, production capabilities. And that's what we need to be thinking about with these new technologies as well. So not just swapping the steam engine to an electric engine. CRISPR, one of these technologies, quantum technologies, space technologies. What do all those mean for you or for your business? But there are a lot of other kinds of data that we know about the future, like urbanization, which is currently in India somewhere in the 20s. It's forecasted to hit 50% by 2050. What does that mean? That's both an opportunity and a threat. Or birth rates. In South Korea, birth rates are the lowest in the world at the moment. The replacement level, which means that the population would stay the same size, each female should give a birth to an average of 2.1 babies. Currently that number is 0.68. That's a catastrophic situation. The UN population forecast for China, where they currently have 1.44 billion people, is for China to have 700 million people in 2100. And think about that. Currently they have housing for twice that number of people. They have services available for twice that number of people. What kind of an impact will there be on the society when it halves in size? In 2050, 50% of global newborns will be in Africa. What kind of repercussions will that have in all of our lives? In 2040, 40% of all newborns will be Muslims. Will that have an impact? Either directly or second level, third level impacts on your life. Currently already more than half of world spending is done by people over 50. That's a significant change from the core assumptions underneath businesses just 10, 20 years ago. And not many have realized that this has changed. In Japan, roughly 40% of people will be over 65 by 2050. Already today, sales of adult diapers have exceeded the sales of baby diapers in many countries. if you are in the Pampers business, there's a pretty drastic change in your customer base. But it's not limited to diapers. It's a reflection of the change in society. The neuroplasticity of the brain. In a famous Microsoft study, they claimed that young adults have a lower attention span than goldfish. Even if that's probably not true, there's a change happening in human beings. Dementia-related costs in the US will be over 1 trillion by 2050. With the aging population, increase in dementia, the future doesn't look easy unless we seize the opportunity and find a solution. 42% of Americans are categorized as obese, and that's increasing, tripled over the last 40 years. And it's an opportunity. Novo Nordisk is the most valuable company in Europe because of a diabetics medicine that they came up with, that they found out helps with obesity as well. Over 80% of young adults in Southeast Asia have myopia. That's a pretty drastic number. So why are all these data points important? Because there's lots more that you could know if you looked for those data points, if you asked the right questions. And thinking and acting like I'm describing here increases the likelihood for you to create a successful strategy and executing that better. Because it's all about probabilities. There's very little that is black and white. And the further you look into the future, the broader the range of the possible becomes. But not all that is possible is plausible. So if you can narrow that down and understand what is plausible, you can also pinpoint what is probable at any given time. And you definitely know what is preferable from your point of view. And then your own actions can bring the probable and preferable closer together, which is what you want to act on. And you can use technology to train that power of foresight. AI can be a great help for bringing you the data that is relevant to you. And if any of these got your synapses firing, take action. Because these data points mean nothing unless you do something about it. Thank you very much.